I've had a bit of a sketchy time with Pac-Man so far on this channel because of how uncharacteristically poor the Game Boy version was. I won't go into it too much here, you can go watch that video for yourself if you want, but essentially the screen ratio was all wrong, with the two viewing options going too far either end of the visibility spectrum. On one hand, you could barely see a quarter of the board at any one time, meaning you were likely to lose your place more often than normal, and you never quite know where all the ghosts are. Or you could zoom out and reduce all the dots to a mere pixel each. If you're into Game Boy, I'm just going to assume you're old enough that your eyesight has also deteriorated to the point where that presents an obvious problem. As well as that, there's this weird bug in the coding, which apparently I've been told is actually in other versions too, not that I personally have ever come across it anywhere else, whereby you can sometimes pass through a ghost rather than consume them, and it happened more often than you'd imagine. Anyway, it's nearly 10 years after the release of the DMG version that we'd get this Neo Geo Pocket Color one. While Pac-Man has, to this point, had well over 30 different ports across so many consoles and computers since the 80s, that must be a record, right? Interestingly, this port was the first one that SNK put on any of their Neo Geo consoles. Not only that, this title is literally the only thing Namco ever had a hand in on any SNK system, in any franchise. Very little crossover between the two indeed. I suppose that had something to do with SNK's prevalence in the world of arcades. Namco would probably have considered them fairly big rivals, especially in the world of fighting games. Now, I refuse to believe there's anyone watching this that doesn't know the concept of Pac-Man, so I'm not going to waste too much of your time by going into the intricacies of the game. Oft imitated throughout the golden years of arcade, and even after, it actually wasn't the first collect the dots game to be released. That honor goes to Sega's 1979 release Head On, which itself was released on Game Boy as Power Racer, around the same time that the Pac-Man port came out, interestingly. Although, clearly, this was the title that popularized the style, as rather than just racing unidirectionally around a grid maze, with your only inputs being switching lanes every now and then, you could now fully navigate a maze, moving in any direction you choose to. On each level, you need to collect all the small pellets while avoiding the monsters. Also, interestingly, but literally only to retro Poindexters like me, Inky, Blinky and all them weren't called ghosts until the release of the Atari 2600 version. If you collect one of the 4 power pellets anywhere on the map, you then become the hunter for a bit and can consume the ghosts, after which they'll return to the center. I don't always like to compare ports of games, preferring to review them subjectively based on the consoles they're being played on. However, I think it's got a relevance with this one. Like with the Game Boy version, you have a choice between scrolling mode and zoomed out mode. Scrolling comes with the same problems as before, whereby you might lose track of what pellets you've collected and you're never 100% sure if a ghost is gonna pop out from somewhere you didn't expect. The only way to play the game here is the zoomed out mode, which would have also been true for the Game Boy one if you are actually able to see the bloody dots. It's not as bad as I'm making out, I'll grant you, but it can't be argued that the Neo Geo version is much better. That's helped by the colours, of course it is, which are vibrant and bold, just like the arcade version. There's something about using the clicky stick which works really well here. When it's essentially a D-pad crossed with an arcade stick, which probably has something to do with it, the controller can comfortably straddle both camps. I've waxed plenty lyrical about my love for the Neo Geo controller up to now, and playing stuff like this only confirms it for me. It should go without saying that having the colours really helps here, and what you may not realise is that the 4 different coloured ghosts actually have slightly different behaviours. You don't know that on the Game Boy version, obviously. The blue one likes to stay away from Pac-Man for the most part, the orange one dawdles about like he doesn't know what's happening, however the pink one is super fast, faster than you actually, but doesn't like to turn corners all that much, and the red one is a real hunter who actively follows you. Knowing which ghost is which can allow you to think about your movements a bit more, knowing what further risks you can take and so on. If you're playing casually, it doesn't really matter, but for aficionados, it's definitely something you want. As for other colorized versions, let's ignore the Game Boy Advance version because that doesn't exist yet. The only other one is the Sega Game Gear port. That one's fairly similar to this, despite coming out quite a few years before this, in 1991. I guess the only logical way to end this review, seeing as how we've given in and compared Pac-Man to its other handheld cousins, is to decide which is the definitive portable version of the arcade classic. I do really enjoy the Game Gear version, and it gets a lot of credit for being way earlier than this. However, you know what? I think the Neo Geo port of Pac-Man is the way to go. It does everything right.